this is one of those subjective measures that I think people need to have some sense of what their quote unquote baseline really is. And I'm guessing that the time to assess that might best be when initiating or midway through a relatively low intensity training phase, maybe during the time of year in which all the other factors that can influence libido are not at their maximum. If you think about, light and dopamine and the relationship between those and the testosterone and estrogen systems, we know that libido, testosterone and estrogen in men and women tends to peak in the summer months. Mm-hmm. So if that's your baseline that you're comparing to, I don't know that that's as reliable as picking something like the fall or the spring.
Yeah.
And so anyway, this again is very subjective, but we just encourage people to recognize that there's no standard numbers for this. It's just something to keep in mind as people do comparisons or subjective comparisons, is don't pick a comparison to an extreme. Try and pick a comparison to a average as you know it to be.
To not only change what's happening today, but we're trying to cause adaptation that may take us weeks or months to actually access.
One of the more obvious ones to me now that you've said this is heart rate.
Absolutely.
If my heart rate goes very, very high during exercise, and I do that fairly consistently or even semi-consistently, my resting heart rate will actually be quite a bit lower.
That's a fantastic example. Really what you're getting at here is this concept where I think it's important to differentiate between adaptation and optimization. If you're optimizing for the current moment, you're almost surely compromising delayed adaptation, right? If I were to say, do the thing right now that makes you feel the absolute best in the world, and you're like, great, you took a nap and you ate a donut, like, awesome, you feel amazing. But it's causing long-term issues. The same can be said on the back end. If you're never choosing things that make you better right now, you're never actually going to see any adaptation. So what we're really doing with this recovery conversation is playing this game of balancing immediate gratification with delayed gratification.
I do want to acknowledge, however, what is absolutely true, which is that overreaching too much, too often, overtraining, these can degrade performance. But mechanistically speaking, what's going on? Because I think once we understand what's going on mechanistically, then I think we can all look at tools, whether or not it's breathing, movement, compression, thermal, psychological, motivational, etc., and have a much clearer sense as to what's going to work best and what likely won't work.
I would actually say this is another time to re-emphasize something we talked about at the beginning of our conversation, which is that pain itself is not a defined outcome. It's heavily influenced by your perception. And so if you don't feel like they work for you, they won't work. If you feel like they work fantastic, they do.
One final point about deliberate cold exposure I think worth mentioning is one of the reasons the shower is effective but not nearly as effective as cold water immersion or immersion in ice up to the neck is simply because of the reason you stated before, which is that most showers are not going to get that cold. Yeah. You're not going to get down, into the sub 40s. You can't really control for how much of the body is covered, whether or not the head stays under different sized bodies, etc. Whereas when people come into a laboratory, they can get into a cold water tank. We know where the neck is, we know where the chin is, and we can make sure that people's arms and legs are underneath. That said, would you agree that if one wants to use deliberate cold exposure, that cold shower is better than nothing, and cold immersion in circulating cold water or ice bath is better than cold shower?
It's important to note is they did another protocol, which was really, really cool. And we're going to come in every day for 2 weeks, and we're going to do 10 sets of a 1 rep max every day for 2 weeks. I was actually able to be around when they were doing some of the final analyses there of the tissue. What they want to look at in this particular study was beta-adrenergic receptors, which are those receptors that are going to be epinephrine and such are going to be binding for. So again, similar story here. A couple of things that happened is the 1 rep maxes dropped by, I think, around like 8 kilos by the end of the 2 weeks. It was about 160 kilos, and they dropped to like 152 kilos, something close to that. What was more significant, though, was their power dropped by 35%, which is really, really interesting because if you pay attention to declines in physical performance over time, and I mean that like through aging, what you'll see is people can hold on to muscle mass pretty well, It will go down by about 1% or so after the age of 40. However, strength will go down at like 2 to 4%, and then power by 8 to 10%. And if you look at actually world records across strength sports, you'll see that they will decline by age, but not that much. Some of them, it took them up to 8 weeks before they finally got back. So they probably were in a classic overtraining state at that point.